Hello, I am pleased to welcome you to episode 7 of Schwegman, Lundberg, and Woosner's Life Sciences Seminar Series. I am Nicholas Lanzatella, your moderator for the series. During this series, attorneys from the SLW law firm having a background in chemistry or biology present on various topics in the life sciences in patent law. This will be the last seminar of the Life Sciences series for this season. The next season will start in the fall. If you have attended 3 or more of these presentations live and you have a mailing address in the US, we will send you a free gift. I want to give a big thanks to all of the attorneys who presented during the series and also thank all of the many audience members who attended the series. You all helped to make the Life Sciences Seminar Series a big success. Slides for today's presentation will be available in the chat, and a link will be emailed to you also. As a reminder, nothing in today's presentation should be regarded as legal advice. If you are seeking legal advice, please consult your legal counsel. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, my colleague, Trevor Lind. Trevor is a patent attorney with extensive experience with technologies such as cloud computing, computer hardware, software, polymers, solutions, semiconductor processing, small molecules, synthetic biology, sequencing technologies, medical imaging, and medical devices. Trevor has unique experience in the complex intersection of the life sciences and electrical arts, such as DNA computing technologies, machine learning to predict patient outcomes, machine learning to design large molecules and optimize large molecule production, and algorithms to analyze and evaluate clinical trials data. Trevor has both his bachelor's in chemical engineering and his law degree from the University of Texas at Austin. The title of Trevor's presentation is IP Protection for Computational Technologies Used in the Drug Discovery Pipeline. If you have questions, please put these in the Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a little Q&A button you can click. Put your questions there, and the speaker will answer these during the presentation. Without further ado, go ahead, Trevor.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm glad to be able to give this presentation. I just want to give a little bit of my background. Nicholas did a great job of that, and I have been fortunate enough to be able to practice in both the electrical arts and software arts and the life science and chemical arts during my career. And over the past 7 years or so, 8 years, I've had different opportunities to be able to sort of practice in the crossover area where the life sciences and computer sciences come together. And it's a fascinating area. It's new, different, and I feel like I've learned so much from it. I think that each area has a lot to give to the other. There's a lot of techniques that can be used in patent applications, in the drafting and prosecution for the computer sciences that can be helpful for the life sciences, and the life sciences that can be helpful for the computer sciences. And so hopefully I'll be able to share that knowledge today. I'm trying to make this as practical as possible and get in putting tips in the presentation. But there's also some legal things to cover and some background to cover as well. There are a couple things I wanted to just sort of at the beginning mention. One of them is, it talks about drug discovery in the title, but this is sort of any, drug or therapeutic that can be used to help treat diseases. There's going to be times when I'm going to reference cases, and I might not go into a ton of detail about them, and there's not a lot of legal cases that are specifically on point in this particular area. But there's a lot that we can glean from other cases, and so I'll talk about those. And then you'll probably hear me talk about like computer architecture and framework, that sort of thing. And what I'm meaning by that is just the way that the components within a particular machine learning model or any computational model or system are arranged and put together. So is it a convolutional neural network? Is it a combination with something else? Is it a transformer network? What do those layers look like? What is the flow of data through them? So I'll just sort of use a fairly broad terms to talk about those. But that's what I'm meaning, and hopefully we'll be able to get to the end of a case study, and you'll be able to see it a little bit more. So I'll go ahead and turn off my video, and then Michelle, if you could go to the next slide, please. So our topics to be covered today is we'll just look briefly at the therapeutics development process. Most of our discussion today is going to be around patents, but I do want to mention trade secrets and some of the considerations of patents versus trade secrets. And then a legal framework for patent protection. We're going to focus on sections 101 and 112 of US Code. We'll look a little bit on the statutory part of 101, but there's also some judicial exception parts we'll look at for 101 as well. But that's where, so there's, we also see prior art rejections and those sorts of things, but there's a lot in this crossover space where we have 101 and 112 issues that come up that that are addressed, that can be addressed in a particular way. And so that's what we're going to focus on the most. As we go through that legal framework, I'll talk about practical aspects of patent application drafting and prosecution, and provide some examination insights as well. And hopefully at the end, I did multiple case studies, but I think hopefully we'll have time for one of those by the time we have time to wrap everything up. So next slide, Michelle, please. And you can go to the next one too. So, so an overview, I think most everyone's probably pretty familiar with the drug development process, but I'm just going to talk about it a little bit to kind of help frame the discussion today. And, in the drug development process, it's about being able to, find therapeutics that are going to be able to be helpful to people. So, whether that's, a small molecule, whether it's a larger molecule, or it's something that modifies genomic regions, whatever it happens to be, it's trying to be able to be able to use machine learning and AI to accelerate that process, because it's a long process. It can be very time consuming and expensive. And so to the extent that machine learning and the computational algorithms and the processing power and memory that's available now can be used to accelerate that, there's lots of folks that are sort of using that to their advantage. And it can be used all throughout the drug development process. So could you go to the next slide, please? So, so the target identification process is, just being able to find, what is a disease's mechanism? How is it working within a person or a subject? And what can we do to be able to sort of modulate that activity and the pathways that are being affected by it in order to be able to provide benefit? And so AI can definitely be used to be able to identify those, and then be used to find leads and candidates that can do a good job of being able to modify the target so that it can alleviate diseases or symptoms. And then there's also, of course, the optimization process, where sometimes you have many leads that seem to be able to have a good properties and be able to have binding or some kind of impact on a particular pathway, and those might need to be modified. So to be able to either perform better, like be more viable in treating the disease, or they may need to be modified to survive better in vivo or through the manufacturing process, whatever it happens to be. The machine learning can be able to be used to identify the candidates that could be most likely to do that. And the clinical trials is another part of everything. And there isn't, it's not maybe quite as exciting, I guess, as some of the others. And it doesn't necessarily, I think it does save time and money in some senses, but it's not quite. The first three are where there's a lot of at least where I see a lot of the innovation taking place. But the clinical trials can be really important in identifying patients that can most benefit from a therapeutic, sort of being able to analyze that data and find out what's working and what's not. And then on the manufacturing side of things, sometimes when you've done all of this work and you have a molecule, it might be tough to be able to get it through the manufacturing process, or figuring out how to scale up from the lab to a bigger facility. And so machine learning can be helpful to do that, and also to be able to be used in the control process of just being able to change the equipment and modify the way that that's being operated during the manufacturing process. So there's lots of different ways that machine learning can be used within the drug development process. And so, and they're all bent towards and going towards trying to be able to just help get treatments to people as soon as possible. So next slide, please, Michelle. Thanks. So now we'll look at just different ways that these computational technologies can be developed. Next slide, please. So patents or trade secrets. So there's a lot of different considerations to be able to weigh if you're deciding on patents or trade secrets. Patents, they exclude someone from making or using or selling the patented subject matter for about 20 years. Trade secrets, there's no time limit on it as long as the information is kept secret. But of course, if the information is no longer secret, then the trade secret's destroyed. And with patents, it does require public disclosure. So it's a weighing of, do I publicly disclose how I'm doing something in order to get this 20-year right to exclude others? Or is it something that I would want to try to be able to keep trade secret? And it's not always an easy decision, but hopefully we'll be able to at least provide some information that can help you in that determination. Next slide, please. So one part of that is public disclosure of information, and I have this on choosing between patents and trade secrets, but I think it's just, I get a lot of questions about this, and I can see folks run into problems around this too, even with patents, where public disclosure of information can cause a loss of rights. So in trade secrets, it can destroy the trade secret. In patents, it can keep you from being able to obtain patent protection for what your invention is if it's been publicly disclosed outside the company. There's some jurisdictions like the US that have a grace period, and 1 year from that public disclosure, you need to file the patent application. Others, it's it immediately, like Europe, you immediately will lose patent rights once there's an enabling disclosure outside the company. And so this is just a graphic to the way I try to help companies think about it is you're this box and there's all this innovative and really great information that's being generated internally. And a lot of times you want to share that with others and share that with people outside of the company. And there's a lot of ways that that can happen, whether it's through presentations at conferences, whether it's through papers, whether it's talking to potential partners, investors, that sort of thing. And so it's just important to be able to realize that whenever information is going out of your company, it's important to be able to think of the IP implications of that, and to be able to work with whomever your IP attorney is to be able to talk to them about what's being disclosed, and either file a patent application around it, modify the information that's being disclosed, whatever it happens to be, in order to be able to make sure that those rights are protected. And then for sure, if it's trade secret protected, just making sure that that information isn't something that's able to leave the company. Next slide, please. A couple of other considerations for deciding whether or not to choose patents versus trade secrets are, whether or not it's reverse engineered. So trade secret doesn't provide the protection for someone who comes along and either reverse engineers what you've done and what your trade secret is, or independently develops it on their own. So that's very possible, and it has definitely happened. And so if there's a product that's out on the marketplace and you can take it apart or you can analyze it and figure out what's being done, then it might be easily reverse engineered. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The detectability of the technology. Sometimes technology is really deeply hidden within a company, and it's only used internally, and it's not going to be able to find its way out of the company, and there's no there's no desire to be able to share it outside the company. So that's something that might lend itself more towards trade secrets. The type of information being protected, there's different things that can be trade secret protected that can't be patent protected, like customer lists and other kinds of like internal workflows and that sort of thing that can be know-how that might be able to be protected under trade secrets, but wouldn't be protected under patents, which are focused on utility and design aspects. And then there's always the business considerations of how fast is the technology changing? Is there fundraising? Are the investors asking about your patent portfolio? What's your IP strategy? It's always so important whether you choose patents or trade secrets to be able to have a clear strategy so that the investors understand how the your technology is being protected and why. Sometimes in industries where there's high employee turnover, knowledge just kind of moves from place to place, and it can be hard to show that there's some kind of misappropriation of the trade secret if that's the case. And so that sometimes can lend itself a little bit more towards patenting technology rather than trade secret. And then just looking at what others are doing in the space, whether or not there's, sometimes folks can be some industries and technical spaces, there's lots of patent applications being filed, and it's just very important to the companies in that space. And others, it's not quite so much. So, but if there's a lot of folks around you, it can be helpful to have a robust patent portfolio, especially if there's, if it tends to be a litigious environment where there's lots of opportunities for licensing or cross licensing. Next slide, please. So we'll move into the legal framework for patent protection and focus on, and so like I mentioned earlier, we'll focus mostly on patents because that's an examination process that takes place in the US and throughout the world. You file your patent application and it goes to different patent offices and they go through examination and they have various guidelines for how you grant a patent application. Some of those tend to pop up and be more difficult hurdles to work through than others. And we're going to focus on a couple of aspects of US patent law that can come up in this space. And so the first one is under Section 101 of the US Code. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is just the statute itself, and as you can see, it's from 1952, and it's pretty straightforward about being able to obtain a patent for new useful improvements and that sort of thing. So this is started to come up a little bit, well, more, but not. So can you go to the next slide, please? I'll sort of explain a little bit better. Thanks. So so I want to talk about this in the context of, because you hear this more often about AI being an inventor and that sort of thing. And the cases have come out to where AI cannot be an inventor, that it needs to be a person. So whoever invents or discovers any new useful process may obtain a patent. And one of the main cases that came out around this was Thaler versus Badal. And Thaler had this collection of software that he had put together, and he had he had basically claimed that the patentable subject matter came from AI. And it was his two patent applications. One was a light beacon that flashes in a new and inventive way to attract attention, and another was a beverage container based on fractal geometry. So this is what the invention was, and he said that his artificial intelligence algorithm was the one that invented it. And so it went to court, and the Federal Circuit held that the inventor is limited to natural persons and doesn't include AI, which is similar. So Thaler also filed against the commissioner director of the U.S. Copyright Office for AI produced material that he claimed the AI was the author of, and it's similar finding in that the author needed to be human, and in this case, the inventor needed to be human. But because of that, there can be certain consequences that we at least need to be able to be aware of. Next slide, please. So, and like I said, there's no specific cases where this has happened, and there's no, I haven't necessarily seen where this might be able, this has come up specifically, but If the situation arises where AI is found to actually be an inventor for some reason, then you might not be able to obtain patent protection, or you may lose your patent on that subject matter. So the place where this is, in the computational methods themselves, at least from what I've seen, this is probably pretty unlikely right now. Generative AI is definitely used to write code, but there's a lot of human intervention in that. And so I think that's a little bit harder to be able to make a case that AI is an inventor. It could be, maybe down the road something that may happen, but I haven't seen that now. The other place where that could happen is that in the molecules that are generated by machine learning. So if you have an AI model and it's providing either small molecules or it's providing protein sequences, then if those sequences are, able to just sort of be produced without any kind of, just conventional ways, and if there isn't a lot of human involvement in being able to sort of move that sequence through to actually being used in a treatment, then that's something where I think it's just important to be aware that this is out there, and that someone might come along one day and challenge whether it's whatever technology it happens to be, um, based on AI being an inventor. And so, can we go to the next slide, please? So as I mentioned before, like the current computational methods are probably likely to avoid this. One thing that helps with therapeutic sequences and structures is the doctrine of simultaneous conception and reduction to practice. So, so oftentimes, especially with different small molecules, you need to really tweak the molecule itself and make changes to it after you found a good lead, and that's a lot of times done by humans. And so what happens is, and you need, in order to be able to synthesize it, the process isn't necessarily predictable. It might be a difficult process, an unpredictable process. And so in that case, when you reduce it to practice, when you have just figured out how to be able to synthesize the molecule, some of the cases have found that conception happens at the same time. And so if there's a reduction to practice where a human is involved in being able to do that, then it goes back to conception, and then you wouldn't have to worry about someone saying, "Oh, AI is the inventor here," because humans have made contributions to that. But I think that the main takeaway from this is all a really unknown area. Like I mentioned, there's no specific cases in the life sciences around this, but the one takeaway I think is just to consider documenting human contributions to therapeutics development when AI is used. So whether that's in the models themselves or whether that's in how the therapeutic is being developed, I think it's important to just make sure that those human contributions are there, just in case at some point down the road this becomes more of an issue. You can always point to that, and you can be able to overcome that sort of argument. Next slide, please. So the second part of 101 that I'd like to talk about, and we see this very regularly in patent applications in this space, is the judicial exception. So the Supreme Court found that there's this implicit exception for what is eligible to become a patent, the type of subject matter that's eligible to become a patent. And it excludes laws of nature, natural phenomena, and abstract ideas. And so there's, many cases around all of these different exceptions. The one that tends to apply the most for the computational technologies is abstract ideas, although we will look at a case where that got all mixed up. It's mostly the abstract ideas. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I do want to say that the USPTO and the courts have not sort of, but they have definitely provided a framework for being able to analyze any particular claim around the abstract ideas exception, and it has you know, they have various steps, but there's one step that's called step 2A. It has two prongs to it. Prong one is this an abstract idea or not? And then prong two is, are there any additional elements that would, in the claim, that would bring this into a practical application, that bring the claimed elements into a practical application? And then it's step 2B, are there additional elements that make it that are significantly more than the judicial exception itself. So it's a very sort of legal framework, lots of terms in there that have various meanings to them all. But they show it as a flow chart on their website, and it's usually it's a flow chart that just helps examiners to sort of step through these different steps and these different prongs to be able to determine if something's subject matter eligible or not. So what we'll talk about now is sort of how the U.S. Patent Office is looking at this, and some like drafting techniques can be able to help us to address the objections and rejections that you might find in it. Next slide, please. So the USPTO has put guidance out based on the case law about the different computational technologies and sort of where we see these rejections happen most often. And one part of that is mathematical concepts. So they'll say, oh, this is just math, simple math, and it's just some kind of formula, and it's not patent eligible for that. And I think that, in the beginning, it's sort of, well, we don't want someone to patent F equals MA or PV equals NRT or something like that. But it tends to be used a little bit more broadly than that. But in the machine learning situations, there's different ways that we can address this kind of rejection if you find it. There's also, under the abstract ideas exception, methods of organizing human activity, which doesn't come up very much at all in the drug discovery practice that I've seen. It can come up in other places, but not necessarily there. The mental process can, where the examiners or litigants could argue that it's possible that the claim method could be performed in the mind of a human. It might be possible to use a computer, but it's still to the point to where a human could actually perform this. So, and that one's interesting and fascinating to sometimes see how far, sometimes some folks take that. Sometimes I feel like they go way too far, that, the human mind is capable of a lot of amazing things, but some of these, I think it can be a bit of a stretch. And then they also, part of the subject matter eligibility analysis is just looking at improvements to the functioning of a computer or to technology. And so that's something that can, outside of these three areas above, and arguing sort of around those, that's something else that can also be able to help move your case forward. And we'll take a look at each of these in turn. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's not really very many cases at all where you can look at 101 and the drug development pipeline. But there's a very recent case, Recentive Analytics versus Fox, and then there's a couple of older cases that are sort of adjacent. They're in the life sciences, and they use computational technologies, and we'll talk about those as well. But Recentive is really new. It just came out in April of this year, and there were two patents that Fox had acquired or obtained, and one's directed to scheduling live events, and the other was to mapping live events to television stations. And the claims were directed and claimed using machine learning models to be able to determine which stations are going to you could use to show these live events and when to schedule them. And then the other one was which stations would be able to show them. So but it's really high level, and it basically just says machine learning is being used to perform a couple of different steps. And in the specifications, and there's no other detail to the machine learning besides that. And both the specifications state that any suitable machine learning technique can be used. So it's very broad, super open. And the scheduling live events patent application did have some examples. It had a list of what the machine learning techniques were, but it didn't say really anything about them, if they were modified or changed or anything along those lines. So there wasn't a lot of meat to the machine learning aspect there. And so so I put a quote there from the conclusion of the case. So they found that the claims were not patent eligible, that they were directed to an abstract idea. And part of the line is we hold that patents that do no more than claim the application of generic machine learning to new data environments are patent ineligible. And it talks about without disclosing improvements to the machine learning models to be applied. So, and a lot of folks sort of see this as just putting generally machine learning into a particular context isn't going to be able to help you overcome 101. And so we'll talk about some of the practicals in that later. Next slide, please. So one case where we at least have life science subject matter in it is 23andMe versus Ancestry. And this is a pretty old case. And in this situation, the claims included a computer in some of the operations, but it wasn't necessarily clear that they were involved in all of them. And there wasn't a lot of detail around that. And so it's actually the court. So there's no like opinion from the Federal Circuit on this that's written, but and I'm not sure if the audio is still available, but I remember, going through listening to the audio, it was fascinating to be able to try and understand their weighing of, is this a law of nature or is this an abstract idea? Because it's around a lot of haplotype, determining haplotypes and being able to use inheritance by descent, the IBD methods, and that sort of thing to be able to determine if people were related to each other. And so I think because there was very little around the computational aspects of this, they actually found that it was closer to laws of nature. And then they said that it was too close to the intrinsic nature of DNA and found that it wasn't patent eligible subject matter. So it was interesting to be able to see, just the importance of being able to make sure your claims are focused on the computational aspects and make that clear, because then that at least moves you out of the laws of nature and gets you into the abstract idea part of the analysis. Next slide, please. So then the Stanford case, so this is a claim where, so in the claims, it talks about using a hidden Markov model to determine inherited state for a little information. And also it determines the haplotype phase based on the inheritance state and other different kinds of information. A lot of the claim elements were focused on receiving, storing, and providing. There was not a lot about, it's the hidden Markov model. There wasn't a lot in the claims or the specification about, we needed to be able to really change this and make this different from just a vanilla model, like how it would generally be implemented, or it wouldn't be implemented by anything other than, sort of routine changes to be able to analyze this information. And so, because of that, the court found that it wasn't patent eligible. One of the things that I thought was interesting about this was that there was an improvement that was clearly described in the specification. So it said that, the previous method, they are able to provide long range phasing for approximately 80% of heterozygous positions. And then the new one is it provides the Stanford method provides accurate long range phasing at 97.9% of all heterozygous positions. So it's definitely it's sort of an improvement on what had been done previously. But I think just the lack of sort of like showing the different changes or modifications of the model, or having just more about that within the claim, I think that made it hard for them to sort of latch on to this improvement and show that it was something in the technology. And this is a quote at the bottom talks about that the process yields a greater number of haplotype phase predictions, and it may constitute a new or different use of a mathematical process, but we are not persuaded that the process is an improved technological process. So I think if maybe they had shown and described and claimed a little bit more about changes that they needed to make, either using the hidden Markov model differently, pre-processing the data, that sort of thing, then that I think would have helped this case a little bit more. Next slide, please. So here's some common 101 rejections, drafting considerations, and that sort of thing. I want to I guess just take a little bit of time to provide. So the way that I like to think about the computational cases and where you can sort of focus patent protection and where it can be helpful in looking for ways to address 101 rejections is that you have your model, but you have input to the model and you have output to the model. And a lot of times the input to the model is really important. And sometimes there's pre-processing that needs to happen to the data. There's certain changes that need to be made to it in order to cause the model to be able to work and to be able to provide good results in the end, helpful results in the end. And so that pre-processing can really form, some subject matter that can be used to be able to help in, patenting these kinds of technologies. And then also, within the model itself, so often I see that there's just a lot of changes that are made. It's hard to be able to take just a simple transformer-based network and be able to provide the useful output that someone's looking for. A lot of times the flow of the data through the model, the way that the layers are arranged, the different components, different kinds of models that can be used in conjunction with one another, provide a lot of ways to be able to show that not only is something novel and not obvious, but that it's eligible to be patent protected. And then on the back end, when you get your outputs, sometimes there's certain particular user interface flows. Sometimes you have a manifestation in the physical world, like in control systems and processes and that sort of thing, that can also be helpful in being able to overcome these rejections. And so we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail as we go on. Next slide, please. So in the mental process rejection, where you can just sort of think of it, the examiner or a litigant says you can only think of it in your mind. It's really helpful to include in the specification sort of the complexity and the richness of the technology and the machine learning architecture and that sort of thing, and see that this is complex. This isn't simple. This isn't easy. It's not something that just anybody can do, and you certainly cannot do it in your mind. I think when you include claim elements that focus on the machine learning architectures themselves and how they've been adapted, I see the mental process rejection less because most examiners will realize that this is machine learning. It's a particular model or a particular way of being able to process data that's not able to be done in the human mind. And also considering features that can only be generated by or processed by a computing device and not a human. So sort of like internal workings. I mean, I think it's maybe possible for a human mind to be able to determine a latent space and that sort of thing. But if you describe it in a way that's a lot more complex and there's different operations that are being performed with respect to that latent space, then it's a lot harder to be able to claim that it's a mental process. Next slide, please. So with mathematical concepts, this can sometimes be a little bit more challenging because, as I mentioned before, the software is inherently going to be able to use math. And so it's being able to just point out that this isn't some high-level mathematical concept or formula or that kind of thing. It's actually being based on mathematical concepts. And so if it's helpful to keep equations out of the claims, but that doesn't mean that you won't get allowed claims. I mean, I've definitely seen multiple situations where claims with equations in them are ended up granting patent applications. I think it can be very narrowing at times, but it's possible to overcome one rejections with them in there. But I think it helps to at least not start there. And it's also helpful to avoid language where maybe simple mathematical operations, some average just probability distribution, something along those lines. If you can sort of, without tying them to something more complex, I think the examiners can sort of key in on that and say, oh, this is really simple and it's just simple math. The nice thing is the U.S. Patent Office has come up with multiple examples of what they would consider subject matter eligible. Example 39 is related to training a neural network for facial detection. And This is a quote from it that says, it doesn't recite mathematical relationships, formulas, or calculations, but it's based on those. And, those aren't necessarily recited in the claims. And so it's patent subject matter eligible. So again, I think one of the most helpful parts is being able to include the machine learning architecture, different aspects of that within the claims. Next slide, please. So another part under steps 2A and 2B of the USPTO's subject matter eligibility analysis is practical application. So they have found that if there's additional elements within the claim that are directed to a practical application, it can help you to overcome a one-on-one rejection, whether it's an improvement in the way the computer functions, whether it's a particular treatment, and being able to include that in the claims. But I'll talk a little bit about that later in more detail. So some of these are, affecting a transformation or reduction to practice of a particular article, different thing. I don't see that as much. But if you've had to like construct a hardware architecture in order to process your model, the data from your model, or implement your model, that's something that could definitely be patentable and would help overcome the one-on-one rejection. Next slide, please. So here's just a bunch of different practicals that we can use to be able to overcome these types of rejections. So one thing that I feel like I try to put into patent applications as much as possible is just around the fact that when applicable, you can actually overcome, you actually provide improvement to the way the computer functions somehow. So it's either uses fewer processing resources, you're able to use less memory, that sort of thing. That's one thing that in the Alice decision that they specifically said, oh, this is something that can help you to have patent eligible subject matter. And so a lot of times in my discussions with inventors, I like to ask, so is there anything that you've done where you found out that this was, kind of bulky and not working super well, that you needed to do to maybe speed things up or be able to get it to function more properly. And sometimes I've seen this, when genomic data is being analyzed and there's just huge genes that are being they're going into the model, and they need to do different things in order to be able to just make that possible or make it more feasible. And it helps to reduce the computing resources. And so I just like to ask that question, and then be able to put that into the patent application to be able to point to later to say, oh, this method actually has a tangible effect, and that it helps the functioning of a computer, or it provides some kind of improvement, sort of like the Stanford case did, where it's more accurate. But I think it needs to be paired with some robust claim elements to be able to help that. I do think it's helpful too to connect the claim features to the improvements. That's something that the examiners will say. They'll say that there's even in the cases that there's an improvement, but the claim doesn't. It's not in the claims. So it's just being able to make sure that whenever you have an improvement, it's important to describe and claim how the claim elements that help you to provide that improvement. I do think so. One of the things that's interesting, and this is a little bit jumping ahead too, but I think including data in patent applications that show improvements can be helpful. A lot of times in computational cases in general, data and working examples aren't provided. I think that they can be helpful if you have that information. And you can be able to show that tangibly, here's something that we've done, here's a clear improvement. And then when you can tie that to the claim elements, it really helps to provide a good argument over one-on-one. And again, here, claiming the improvement itself might not be successful without tying that in. So just saying that it's improved might not be as helpful. It helps to be able to tie that directly into the claim elements. And then, so along the side, so I mentioned earlier about treatment. So sometimes what can happen is when you have a particular computational method, it results in an effective treatment. If you tie the model and the treatment together, you might be able to overcome the one-on-one rejection. The caveat to that is that it used to be a little bit, they allow things to be a little bit broader, but they're starting to be much stricter. And so if you meet the Vander requirements, where you're more explicit on the dosing and the just the actual treatment that's being performed, then it's more likely to overcome than not. But it's sort of a cost benefit analysis. I mean, if you don't have to go down that road, I think it's helpful to not go down that road. You can have a divided infringement issue. Sometimes, having all that information in the patent specification isn't possible. A lot of times, you want to separate out your therapeutics from your computational methods. So that's not always hard, but it is possible. And so I did want to mention it. And then in the manufacturing context, so if you're providing control signals that cause equipment to operate in a particular way, that can be persuasive. The USPTO examples, 45 Claim 2 is where the control signals that came from a computer implemented method changed the way the equipment operated, and then it was able to overcome. They said it was patent eligible. Next slide, please. So just a couple of drafting and prosecution guidelines or considerations that I've learned over the years is just as I mentioned, claiming computational aspects and life science aspects separately, sort of letting them have their own life, so to speak, their own sort of patent journey. But it can be helpful to include some parts of the life science in the computational if you feel like you really need it to be able to help overcome the 101 rejection. And then drafting computational aspects from the point of view of the computing device that's performing the operation. So just climbing things that are really high level, sort of how they were done in the 23andMe case, and not focusing on what's happening, what the computer's doing, and how it's using the machine learning architecture and how that's sort of like being processed, I think is helpful to be able to look at, so that you're not claiming just pure functional language and just results of the computational operations, but a little bit more about what those operations are, what's taking place. And definitely, claims that cover core uses and embodiments, and including details about the architecture in the specification, including training. What was the training process like? You don't have to have every single detail in there, but I think that some level of detail is at least important, and you can work that out with your IP counsel. But I think to me, I feel like having that in the patent applications has really been helpful in overcoming some of these 101 rejections, to either show how the model was trained, what the arrangement of the architecture is, the layers and different components and that sort of thing. I think it's helpful to be able to have that in there. Next slide, please. And these are some just others that, talking about not characterizing things as conventional or typical. I think that may have hurt the Stanford case, where they said, oh, this is a typical hidden Markov model. So I think that just sort of explaining how things work and not calling them conventional or typical, especially for elements that are being claimed. The technical problem solution approach is really helpful. It will help in Europe for sure, but it also helps in the US, where you can sort of tie the improvement into the claim elements. That's where that comes into. And then it's just helpful to include as many strategies for overcoming the 101 rejections as possible. Just sort of thinking ahead, what might an examiner say? Might I get a mental process rejection? How can I overcome that? Might I get a mathematical concepts rejection? How would I overcome that? And what are some advantages and practical applications of this? Sort of thinking that through and including all of those different elements in the patent application can be really helpful in overcoming these rejections. Next slide, please. So now we'll look at enablement under 112, and I'll just touch on this a little bit briefly, just to highlight some of the differences between the electrical arts and the life sciences. Next slide, please. So, okay, so enablement is just, providing enough information in the specification so that, someone else skilled in the art knows how to make and use it. So they can basically reproduce what you've done. Next slide, please. So, and so the way that 112 is applied can be different in the different art areas. So predictable arts like computer science is generally labeled as predictable. So if you can conceive of it in your mind, you can code it and it will work. Even though that's not always the case, that's the assumption that's made. The life science innovation is usually interpreted as being unpredictable, where you need to show me data that this works, and they just won't necessarily take your word for it. And the way that this comes in is sometimes in the examination process, where if you're in a computer-oriented art unit, you're less likely to see 112 based on enablement as far as making sure that it's described to a sufficient level. But in the life science art units, you might see this a little more often, especially with newer examiners. Um, they have they reject almost everything under every every grounds that they can think of, and so not only will you see 101s, but you'll also see 112s, and it just helps to be able to have more information about how the algorithm works to help overcome those. So next slide, please. So the reason I wanted to bring up the Macro case is it's actually a case that gets cited a lot in 101 because it was found to be patent subject matter eligible by having an improvement under the step 2A. But it also, there was an enablement inquiry that was done by the court, and the court found that, basically it's this field is generally predictable. And so, they felt like, someone's knowledge of the prior art and routine experimentation can fill in the gaps. So the developers that were challenging Macro's claim actually said that we have evidence of non-enablement of some techniques, but in this case, those techniques weren't being claimed. That's what the court found. And so they said that they were enabled, and then they also applied, the sort of the predictable arts standard, and that this is something that you don't necessarily have as high a standard as in the life sciences. But I just wanted to highlight this just to be aware. Enablement is something to be aware of and make sure that you have a robust specification to be able to help overcome that, any rejections around that. Next slide, please. So this is the Amgen versus Sanofi case, which is not computer oriented. It's, antibody claims to a genus that were overturned, and they were too broad, but I wanted to highlight it because of the USPTO's sort of reaction to it. And so next slide, please. So they came out with some guidelines after Amgen, and they just focused on the case, the Wands case, and they just reemphasized that regardless of technology, it's important to keep into mind these different aspects. And so they go on to list the 7 factors there, and it's just helpful when you're drafting, even on the computational side. I feel like to include to sort of include as much material as you need to try and help satisfy these factors, because just like in Macro, enablement inquiries can come up, and it's just important to be able to have subject matter in there that helps to overcome them. And this way, I think like the crossover between, this is where like practicing in the life sciences really helped me a lot in computational cases, where I felt like, there's a lot of information in here. There's a lot of explaining what's being done and why. And I feel like the computational cases can really benefit from that. And so we don't know where the law is going to go or what's going to happen, but I think sort of looking at it with that, looking at the predictable arts from an unpredictable arts mindset can sometimes be really helpful in being able to draft robust specifications and being able to overcome any rejections you might have along these lines. Next slide, please. So here's just some guidelines with, that we kind of talked a bit about before. The enablement can come up in litigation. Some drafting considerations, again, robust specifications, talk about how the models are trained. It's important to include details about the machine learning architectures themselves. Working examples can be great, I think can be really helpful in just making sure that the claim features are sufficiently described and not necessarily just relying on, there's some things that are very, easy to say that they're conventional or typical, and you're not claiming them, but you want your claim features to make sure that those are sufficiently described and how they're operating, and how the data is being processed with them and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm glad I have at least a couple minutes to go through the case study. So next slide, please. So one of my colleagues, when I was talking to him about the presentation, he said, "Oh, well, there's been a lot of different therapeutics that have been developed where AI was involved in their development, and maybe you could take a look at the portfolios around those and sort of see if there's anything to learn from them. And so I've cited this article here. There's others that talk about it as well. This may have the most comprehensive chart that I saw. So I went through and I picked one of them, and I decided to go ahead and look at their patent portfolio. And for me, it was very validating to be able to see that. I've seen a lot of cases on my own. I've evaluated some portfolios and been able to look at prosecution histories and learned a lot from that. And then looking at this, it was sort of like, okay, this I feel like my experience is just very similar across this company that we're looking at, but then also others where I did case studies that we probably don't have time to be able to get to. So next slide, please. So this is a claim. I know this is a really very detailed slide, but so this is one of the patent applications that is in this family. And on the left is an issued patent and has a claim with elements A through E. It has creating input vectors, inputting the vectors into a machine learning platform, generating a predictive biological aging clock. The claim on the right is a CIP of that one. It also has very similar claim elements, almost exactly the same. The one on the left talks about using a biological data signature. The one on the right is a proteome signature. So next slide, please. So the one on the left went to Art Unit 2883, which is very much a computational art unit. First action, notice of allowance. The one on the right went to 1686, a life science art unit. Some 112 rejections were mostly antecedent basis, 101 rejections, non-statutory double patenting rejections. They didn't even file a response. They just abandoned the case. I feel like they probably could have filed a response, but they chose not to. But I think, and I've seen this, like in my own practice, I've seen where same company, different technology within a portfolio, one case it goes to 2600 or 2800 or 2100, and you get really, generally broad claims, not a lot of one-on-one rejections, and the examiners, are easier to be able to overcome one-on-ones with. And then 1600, it just can be really difficult. Not all the times, but sometimes it can be really, really hard. And so sometimes where you land in the USPTO can have an impact on your on your examination. And so along those lines, I think to the extent possible, it can be really helpful to include the computational architectures and that sort of thing, especially if it's novel. DeepMind has a lot of patent applications that are focused mostly on the architectures themselves, and they say, oh, you can do protein folding with it, but they don't say a lot about it. And so they focus a lot on the architectures themselves. So that's something to be able to keep in mind. But next slide, please. Even within art units, it can be the same. It can be, you can have, different rejections. So this is another application that was in the that portfolio of that company. It went to art unit 2857. There are 101 and 102 rejections. And I've included some of the amendments here, not all of them, but some of them, just to be able to show the types of amendments and features to including claims that you can help to overcome 101 rejections. They put in the encoder, and I mean, it talks about doing, making a latent space, which, that's not a lot to be able to say there, but it does talk about the predictor, and it extracts object property data from the latent code data. Then you update the encoder, you include a discriminator since it's an adversarial autoencoder. So you have like all of these things where you're sort of changing the architecture, you're adding the discriminator in, you're doing all of these different things to where it's hard to make like a mental process sort of rejection, and it's hard to be able to say, oh, this is just math. There's more to it. It's more robust. And this is, in my experience, here are the types of things that I've seen be able to overcome 101 type rejections. And then next slide, this is pretty much the end. So just some observations from the portfolio. The computational methods were examined all over the patent office, even in RD00, which is a new, I don't know how new it is, but it's sort of like a specific art unit. The specifications were robust. They included comparative examples with data in them. I felt like that was really good. The details of the computing architecture were described and claimed, at least in some instances. Their portfolio included composition of matter and treatment-related applications in addition to the computational methods. And those were focused just on those compositions of matter and treatment methods. And I didn't see any manufacturing-related patent applications in there. So it was really interesting to do that, very validating. A lot of the tips and considerations that I gave you above are things that I saw within that patent portfolio and things that I think could be very useful in overcoming one-on-one reductions. And in fact, in many cases, they did. So I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen today. I hope it was helpful. The information was useful at all. And I don't know, Nicholas, I don't know if we have time for a question at all, but that's everything I have.
Well, we do have a few questions, Trevor, and that was excellent. A few questions from the audience. So let me take you back to some of the initial topics you described of patent versus trade secret. And the question is, can trying to maintain technology as a trade secret lead to a later loss of ability to gain patent protection on the technology?
Mm. Well, it's possible. So if so, one scenario where that could take place is you have something as a trade secret, and then um, someone else independently invents it. They can patent it, but you couldn't necessarily. But then in a situation where you sell a product, so Coca-Cola and KFC, they have formulations for their products, and they've been selling them for decades. And there's a 1 year on sale bar in U.S. patent law. And so if it's somehow tied to a product that's being so let's maybe you're providing a service, you're a third-party service provider, you're helping people um, uh, with the manufacturing of their molecules, or you're helping them sort of modify a molecule to help its viability somehow. And you're providing that as a service. If you have trade secret algorithms that are helping you to do that, you wouldn't necessarily be able to go back later, like after a year, and try to be able to patent that because you've already offered the service that's using those computational algorithms. So it's possible. It just depends, and so that's where you just have to sort of consult with your IP counsel and sort of weigh this is our business plan. This is how we intend to use the technology, and then they can be able to help advise you whether or not you can, trade secret would be better than patents because it is possible to not be able to patent something if you've tried to trade secret it in the past.
I agree, and that on sale trigger is a major issue for folks to consider as they
Mhm.
look at trade secret versus patent. Here's another question. The question is, some computational chemistry models generate millions of theoretical compounds in a single docking experiment.
Yeah.
Is there any precedent you are aware of for claiming as yet unsynthesized compounds having desirable target affinity as indicated by the model? And I suppose in your answer, you can assume that patentee has some way of generally describing a suitable way to synthesize the compounds, even though they haven't yet
Mhm.
made them.
There would definitely have to be a way to synthesize in there, you'd have to say it would be sort of a typical way of doing it. There wouldn't have to be anything done out of the ordinary. One thing I feel like that's really interesting about that question is sort of the validity of it. It, and I didn't get into this at all, and it's a whole other rabbit hole around synthetic data and whether or not you can show the efficacy of something through synthetic data or not. Um, and I know that there's situations where there are models that folks have been able to model an outcome better than it's able to be understood and predicted through actual trials, which is fascinating to me, but I don't think we're to the point yet where we're ready to accept all of that. And so I think that that's hard to be able to just take a molecule, right, because it does. That's absolutely right. So these generative models, thousands, millions of sequences, and lots of different ways that they can be used. But I think it is important to be able to make sure that those can be synthesized and that they're efficacious, and that efficacy data ends up being either in vitro or in vivo somehow, at least for now.
What if patentee decides to test just a few of the outputs of the model in order to demonstrate that the model shows, effectively, uh, produces a list of compounds that at least
Mm.
a subset of them work? Do you think that would sway an examiner?
I think it kind of goes back to Amgen where if you can't go too far, if for you have because they claimed the genus and they sort of said no, you have to keep it down to a certain species where you
Sure.
actually provided it. So I think like the model itself, like the architecture that ends up producing that, I think that that can be, that doesn't have to be, that can be a higher level than the compounds themselves, because the compounds themselves are what you're claiming has like a therapeutic effect, and you need to be able to show that. And it's sort of like how far out, how many changes can you really make to those compounds in order for them to still work the way that you're expecting them to. And that's what's hard about the predictable versus unpredictable parts.
Okay, I have a couple more very general questions about AI. The first one is, do you think AI will ever replace human USPTO patent examiners?
I don't know, probably not. I think it's just like, the AI is to the extent that we know it now, AI is a really help can be a really helpful tool. It can be helpful for examiners. It can help them get through searching documents. It can help them in their rejections. There's a lot of different things it can do to be able to help. Just like it can help, anybody in their job. But it has its drawbacks, its limitations. There's a lot of things it's not good at, and some things it's terrible at. So it just sort of depends. I don't, at least for now, probably not, in the next 10, 15 years, probably not, but who knows? I mean, I think there's all kinds of ethical considerations that we have to take into consideration too. And so that's an interesting question, but I don't know. I can't predict the future, but it's hard to see that happening soon.
I think that's a fair answer. Here's a related question, also very general. How do you think that AI will impact your legal career in the short term and in the long term?
Hmm. That's a great question. I mean, so I feel like SLWs really try to be sort of at the forefront of trying to identify how AI tools can be helpful and how they can't be helpful. And so I think that's good. And so I feel like in my own practice, there are times when AI so there's some sort of like rote um, tasks that I need to perform that it can be really helpful for. There's some certain research things that it can be helpful for as long as it gives me citations. Um, when I'm drafting in some of these really complex areas, I don't like doing any drafting is it's not helpful at all. Because it's sort of like too much, and it's not all of the things that I've talked about above. It's hard to be able to get it to put all of those things, take them into consideration, and be able to output something that's actually going to be useful. And so I think in the short term, I think it can be helpful. It can be time saving in some cases, but I think in some of these areas, it's it's a little bit helpful, but it's not super helpful in the actual drafting of the applications. So maybe long term it'll get better. I know there's a lot of improvements, and so it's possible that that it ends up taking away what I do now, or a large part of it. I think there's a lot of strategic parts that we do as attorneys in the way that we advise counsel, and a lot and that sort of thing that I think it's harder for AI to do. But who knows? Again, it's one of those things where it's hard to be able to know.
I agree. It's an interesting question, and the answer to that question, I think, will change over time as AI
Mm,
evolves.
yeah.
So that's all the questions that we have for you today. Trevor, thank you so much for giving that excellent presentation. Audience, if you have additional questions, please feel free to email the presenter. And again, slides for today's presentation are available in the chat, and a link will be emailed to you. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I hope you'll tune in to the next season of the SLW Life Sciences seminar series that will start in the fall. Thank you. Have a great day.